At 14:32 local time, the carrier holds steady on a constant base course, speed unchanged, deck operations continuous. Visibility is clear enough that the horizon line is clean and stable. Sea state is low. No environmental clutter is masking radar performance. The air picture is quiet until it isn't. 3 intermittent radar returns appear on the outer edge of the long-range volume. High altitude, high speed, approaching from the same quadrant with spacing consistent with a coordinated element. Their tracks are not aligned with civilian airways. No cooperative identification is present. The returns strengthen as they close, indicating aspect and altitude stability rather than random pop-up. The first classification shift happens without voice. Tracks are promoted, correlation tightened, and the tactical display stops treating them as background noise. The timing of their appearance suggests deliberate approach rather than incidental transit. The carrier does not alter course. The escorts maintain their screen geometry. Nothing in the formation moves to meet the contacts. The strike group stays predictable, because predictability removes ambiguity from later analysis. At 14:40 local time, the 3 tracks descend slightly and accelerate. Their vector line tightens toward the carrier group's general bearing. The closure rate increases enough that the intercept timeline compresses from hours to minutes. The contacts remain silent. No transponder. No radio. No declared intent. Electronic support measures register intermittent emissions consistent with modern fighter radar modes, brief, disciplined bursts rather than continuous search. The emissions are not strong enough to suggest dedicated targeting. They are strong enough to confirm these are not patrol aircraft. The tracks separate laterally into a shallow wedge, 1 centerline, 2 offset. The geometry is optimized to complicate a single-axis response while maintaining mutual support. Their spacing is too clean for coincidence. The carrier continues flight operations. On deck, the pattern does not pause. Aircraft movement remains procedural, tow bars, deck tractors, and ordnance crews working to schedule rather than to theater. At 14:48 local time, the classification firms as the returns sharpen. The tracks now hold altitude in the high band and maintain supersonic closure with disciplined throttle control. Their bearing rate relative to the carrier group slows, indicating they are shaping toward a controlled approach rather than a pass-through. The strike group's radar horizon is layered, outer volume search, mid-range track refinement, and low-altitude coverage maintained for threats that might not announce themselves. The systems do what they are designed to do first: build certainty before anyone needs to speak. A combat air patrol is already airborne at distance, holding in a standard protective arc. Its orbit tightens by degrees, not miles. The cap does not sprint. It shifts to an intercept geometry that preserves fuel, timing, and options. The 3 inbound tracks continue silent, and silence becomes a data point. If they intended routine passage, they would not need this degree of coordination. If they intended engagement, their approach would not be this clean without additional supporting tracks. What remains is pressure, measured, controlled, and meant to be read. At 14:57 local time, the intercept begins as geometry, not contact. The cap element adjusts heading to place the inbound wedge on the edge of its radar cone, forcing the incoming aircraft to accept being tracked at range. The inbound tracks respond by changing altitude slightly. A small step down, likely to complicate look-down ranges without committing to low altitude. The distance closes into a band where identification becomes multi-sensor. Long-range optics cue from the ships and from the airborne fighters. Infrared search and track begins to matter. The returns now have stable signatures. 3 separate heat sources consistent with fighter-sized platforms in formation. The inbound element tightens its spacing. That change alone signals intent. Loose formations are for transit. Tight formations are for being seen as a unit. The carrier stays on course. The escorts hold their stations. The strike group gives no maneuver response that can be interpreted as avoidance. At 15:06 local time, the first presence move occurs. The strike group shifts defensive posture quietly. Radar modes prioritize track quality. Data links harden their filtering. The system picture becomes cleaner, less tolerant of uncertainty. No alarms, no announcements. The difference is in what the displays stop allowing. The inbound tracks angle a few degrees to align more directly with the carrier's projected track line. Their closure becomes more direct. Their altitude remains high enough to preserve energy. The wedge formation holds. The cap continues on a measured intercept, now clearly between the inbound element and the carrier group. The geometry is deliberate. Keep the carrier out of the immediate problem while creating a barrier the inbound aircraft must acknowledge. The inbound element remains silent on radio. No calls. No identification. No attempt to establish routine procedures. That absence forces the intercept into a purely procedural lane. At 15:14 local time, the three contacts cross into a range where their radar emissions are no longer intermittent. Short, controlled pulses appear more frequently. Their behavior suggests they are building their own track picture, testing range, aspect, and response time. Still no signs of weapons guidance activity. The emissions are structured to pressure, without triggering an unavoidable escalation. The cap now has a stable solution. The intercept line is set so that the U.S. fighters will meet the inbound element at a standoff distance that allows multiple options: visual identification, escort, or forced separation through geometry alone. On the carrier, the deck keeps moving. Launch and recovery cycles remain scheduled. The refusal to pause is part of the posture. Operations continue because the environment is being controlled. The inbound element's bearing rate decreases again. They are not rushing through. They are approaching to be counted. At 15:22 local time, a second U.S. airborne layer adjusts. An airborne early warning platform shifts its orbit slightly, optimizing radar coverage on the inbound element while maintaining separation from any possible forward push. The move is subtle, but changes the information advantage: better look angles, fewer blind spots, tighter correlation. The inbound aircraft respond by splitting their wedge slightly wider, increasing lateral spacing while holding closure. The effect is to force the intercept to account for three separate vectors instead of one consolidated mass. It does not change the outcome. It changes workload. No missiles are launched, no flares, no chaff. The escalation remains in track quality and geometry. The carrier's course line remains unchanged on every plot. At 15:31 local time, the cap reaches the first decisive geometry point, an intercept position that requires the inbound aircraft to either continue directly into a known barrier or adjust. The U.S. fighters do not need to transmit to make the barrier real. Their position does it. The inbound element holds for a moment. The center aircraft reduces speed slightly, visible in the tightening of spacing behind it, then returns to prior closure. It is a hesitation that lasts seconds, but reads clearly in data. The two-wing aircraft make small altitude changes in opposite directions, one up a few hundred feet, one down. The move is not tactically decisive. It is diagnostic, testing whether the intercept response changes with vertical separation. The response does not change. The cap holds its geometry. The carrier continues transit. The escorts do not maneuver. At 15:40 local time, the first countermeasure posture shift occurs without release. Defensive systems adjust their readiness state in a way that is detectable internally, but not broadcast externally. The shift is about timeline, reducing the time from detection to action if the inbound element crosses a line. The inbound aircraft now approach at a range where visual ID is possible under clear conditions. Their profiles are still small against the sky, but they are trackable by optics and IR. The formation remains three-ship, disciplined, with no supporting aircraft appearing on the edges of the picture. That absence matters. A true strike profile would likely show more complexity. Tankers, additional fighters, electronic attack, or at minimum secondary tracks. Here, there are only three. Pressure, not war. The cap maintains separation. The intercept is held at a distance that keeps the encounter controllable. At 15:48 local time, the inbound element makes its closest approach shaping move, a shallow turn that would bring the centerline aircraft toward a forward sector relative to the carrier group, while the wing aircraft maintain offset lines. The geometry suggests an attempt to frame the carrier visually and electronically, maximizing the time they can hold the group in their sensors without overflying. The strike group responds with information dominance rather than motion. Track precision improves. The inbound aircraft are now held continuously in the fused picture. Their speed, altitude, and headings are stable enough to predict. A Seahawk is launched from an escort. The helicopter lifts cleanly and climbs to a modest altitude, moving to a position that provides another angle on the inbound element and the local airspace. It does not race. It does not threaten. It becomes a moving sensor platform and a visible presence close to the surface layer. The inbound aircraft remains silent. At 15:57 local time, the cap adjusts again, tightening its line and raising altitude slightly to improve look-down capability and to reduce the inbound aircraft's options for slipping below the radar horizon. The move is minimal, but changes the intercept math. It places the cap in a position that can respond quickly if the inbound element accelerates or drops. The inbound element answers with a brief speed increase by the outer aircraft, attempting to widen the formation's forward edge. The center aircraft holds, creating a momentary stagger. For the first time, their formation looks less like a single organism and more like three pilots managing slightly different priorities. The Seahawk holds a steady orbit near the surface, maintaining optical track, relaying a stable picture. It stays outside any airspace that could be interpreted as interference. It is present, recorded, and calm. No countermeasures are released. No weapons doors open in any observable way. The escalation remains in geometry. At 16:06 local time, a new classification change occurs. The inbound aircraft behavior crosses from approach to press. Their bearing rate slows further, indicating an intent to remain in a forward sector rather than pass through. The time they are spending in the intercept envelope increases, making the encounter less ambiguous. The cap now holds a position that forces a decision. Continue inward and compress separation, or turn away and accept that the carrier group will not maneuver. The carrier remains on its original heading. The strike group's posture is rigid in its predictability. The inbound aircraft hesitate again. The center aircraft reduces speed slightly and climbs a small increment. The wing aircraft do not mirror cleanly. Their symmetry fractures by small margins that matter in close coordination. At 16:14 local time, the first active countermeasure event occurs, not as a dramatic cloud, but as a controlled defensive action. A small amount of chaff is dispensed by one of the cap aircraft, not as a panic response, but as a test and a reset of the electromagnetic picture after a spike in inbound emissions. The chaff blossoms briefly and falls away behind the intercept line. The inbound aircraft do not launch anything. They do not change course aggressively. Their emissions drop in intensity for several seconds, then return in shorter bursts. The pattern suggests they are probing how close they can get without forcing a kinetic reaction. The Seahawk maintains its orbit, now slightly repositioned to keep both the cap and inbound element in view. The helicopter remains steady and predictable. The carrier continues flight deck operations. No visible interruption occurs. At 16:23 local time, the inbound element breaks its clean press geometry. The starboard side aircraft turns outward by a measurable amount, increasing separation from the intercept line. The portside aircraft holds its previous vector for a moment, creating a gap that looks unplanned. The center aircraft follows the starboard aircraft's outward turn after a delay. The cap does not chase. It maintains a barrier position, allowing the inbound aircraft to open distance without adding pressure that could reignite the press. The response remains disciplined and restrained. The inbound aircraft's speed decreases gradually as they turn away. Their closure rate drops to near zero, then reverses into opening distance. Their formation attempts to reassemble but remains uneven, with spacing that suggests correction rather than confidence. No radio calls are exchanged. The silence remains intact through the turn. At 16:36 local time, the inbound element continues to disengage, now on a vector that takes it away from the carrier group's forward sector. Their emissions become intermittent again, less frequent and less assertive. The cap holds position long enough to confirm the trajectory is stable and not a feint. The Seahawk begins a controlled return toward its ship while keeping the disengaging aircraft in its optics for as long as practical. Its movement remains procedural, a return to baseline once the local air picture relaxes. The carrier remains on course. The strike group does not alter formation geometry. The escorts stay in their lanes. The message stays consistent. Control is maintained without maneuver. At 16:52 local time, the disengagement completes as the three tracks open beyond the high-pressure envelope. Bearings drift slowly. Closure rate is negative and increasing. The air picture returns to its earlier calm state, with the three tracks now moving toward the edge of long-range coverage. The cap relaxes its intercept line into a broader protective orbit without visible urgency. No pursuit geometry is established. The objective remains to prevent re-entry, not to follow. The Seahawk recovers aboard in a standard pattern, rotor wash settling over the deck without incident. The surface and air pictures stabilize into routine monitoring. The carrier continues on the same heading. Speed unchanged. Deck operations continue. The strike group's track line remains straight through the entire event, and the only evidence of escalation is stored in timestamps, radar recordings, and the brief moment when systems tightened the world down to three silent aircraft and the geometry between them.